Okay, I'm going to talk to you about Exodus, the success of the first video being apparently assured. We now move on to the second book in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament, and this book is very different from the first book because the first book, Genesis, interestingly, is not referenced that much in the other books of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. This is especially true of the first 11 chapters, which surprisingly, the Garden of Eden, I think, is mentioned once in the rest of the Old Testament. The Noah's flood, I think, no more than a couple of times in the rest of the Old Testament. The Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, of course, the patriarchs, are mentioned much more. But Genesis is generally made much more of by Christians, especially the creation story, the Garden of Eden, the flood. Those are much more themes of Christian interpretation. For the people of Israel, the central event is the Exodus, the oppression in Egypt, and the Hebrews being led, or the Israelites, as we can now call them, being led out of Israel. Remember, Hebrews is anybody descended from Abraham. Israelites specifically are those people descended from Jacob, the 12 tribes, who are in Egypt and have been oppressed. And Exodus tells the story of their liberation. Exodus literally in Greek means going out of. In Hebrew, the name is Shemuot, which is simply the first word of the book, the first phrase of the book, and that word Shemuot means names. And Exodus begin now, these are the names when they give the genealogy of the Israelites in Egypt. In Greek, once the Bible was translated into Greek, which occurred actually even before the time of Jesus, the books were given Greek names that were more thematic, that were not the first word in the book, but were the theme of the book. And the theme of the book is Exodus, going out of, which is what you call, incidentally, when people like leave the stage in Greek drama, exodos, leaving the stage, going out, get out, get out, get out of Egypt, being delivered from Egypt. That's the book of Exodus. Now, the book of Exodus, as opposed to Genesis, which was a series of stories with multiple generations of heroes, as we discussed in the last video, Exodus has one hero, Moses. Moses has an incredible amount of stage time in the Bible. He's on stage for 4 books. Yes, most of those books is he kind of sits around while God gives laws, or he gives laws, but Moses is present for. You see why the 10 Commandments is such a long movie. Moses is around for a very, very long time. As I said in the online lectures, a lot of what's in the movies about Moses, the being brought up in the royal court, the fighting Africans to the south of Egypt, the having the rivalry with the younger pharaoh, which are all kinds of staples of the adaptations of the material, are not to be found in the book. They are to be found fairly early on in apocryphal accounts and kind of additions to the story made as early as, again, before Jesus in the 3rd century BC. But they are not in their embroidery designed, I think, to fill the gap that we don't actually have that much about Moses' childhood, other than the tantalizing story of him being raised by the Egyptian princess. And in any event, he gets the... God does not talk to him in Egypt. God does not speak to Moses in Egypt. God only speaks to Moses in the land of exile, in Midian. And Moses leaves. He marries a local girl, Zipporah, another meeting at the well. And it's in exile in the desert that God appears to him as a burning bush and announces his unmentionable, indescribable name, and gives Moses his mission. He goes back to Egypt. He says, I'm not eloquent, I can't speak, so I'm going to need my brother Aaron to speak for me. Once we work out that Moses' own children, for whatever reason, aren't going to be lineal leaders of Israel, and that Aaron's children are, that Eleazar and Phinehas, Eleazar and Ithamar, and then Phinehas, Eleazar's son, are going to be the priestly leaders of Israel. There are kind of 2 kinds of leaders. There are the political leaders like Moses and the priestly leaders like Aaron. That's a kind of dyad. It's like, the king and the pope in the Middle Ages. And once we work out that Aaron's descendants are going to lineally inherit, there's a reason why Aaron is involved. I think that is, in a way, why that's put in the narrative, is to protect the prerogative of the hereditary priests. Incidentally, the word for priest in Hebrew is Kohan, and that's why Cohen, Cohen, is such a frequent surname among Jewish people. So Aaron speaks for him, pleads with Pharaoh, to no avail. Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and some of the comments you guys just made online were very good about that. The sense that God wants a decisive drama. God does not want what we all want in the Ukraine right now, which is a negotiated settlement without war. God, although I very much on one side of the Ukrainian question, and you can probably guess which one. But nonetheless, we don't want war. Nobody wants war. And, you would think God would have a negotiated settlement. No. God wants a decisive break between Israel and Egypt. Israel has gone into Egypt because of the famine, because of Joseph, but God doesn't want the Israelites to settle down in Egypt. He wants to bring them back to the promised land where they could recoup the original gift he made to Abraham many generations ago. So he won't permit a negotiated settlement. And things become worse and worse. God visits 10 plagues on the Egyptians, the first 2 of which, intriguingly, the Egyptian priests match. And it's a rare admission by the Bible that there are other magics or other forces in the world. There are, as Star Wars might call it, dark sides of the Force, that the first 2 plagues can be matched. There's enough dark magic to do that. Once we get to the 3rd plague, though, you sense in the sense that God's magic, the higher magic, will win out. And eventually, of course, the terrible last plague that God kills the firstborn son of every Egyptian. And we've discussed how important firstborn sons are in this world. That a firstborn son was your pride and joy, and we saw that with Isaac, his firstborn legitimate son. How important that was to Abraham. And that's a devastating loss for the Egyptians. And of course, how does God know not to kill the firstborn sons of the Israelites, who are people in Egypt at that point? They are also resident in Egypt. It is because the houses are specially marked, and so God passes over them. And so, therefore, the holiday is Passover, the major Jewish holiday that we're about to celebrate in a month and a half, probably. That's why it's called that. The Hebrew name is Pesach, incidentally, Pesach. And there's a relation between that and Easter, because the Last Supper, Jesus' Last Supper, was in fact a Passover Seder, the ceremonial meal that's held to mark the occasion of the Passover. That's a big occasion for Jews. And Jesus, as an observant Jew, was having a Seder when he was arrested, on what Christians call Holy Thursday, when he was arrested. And in consequence, in Latin languages, and languages derived from Latin, French, Spanish, etc., the word for Easter is Pascua, Pak. It has that relation to the Hebrew Pesach. Easter in English, that's a takeover of a pagan spring festival, Eostre, which was Christianized and taken over. And so that's why we call it Easter. But the other languages preserve that kinship between Passover and Easter, and that's why they're always roughly at the same time, because the Christian calendar with respect to the Jewish calendar is eccentric. They're not always exactly at the same time, but they're always roughly at the same time. So the Israelites go out of Egypt. They cross the Red Sea. It's a great miracle. We have those wonderful celebratory songs by Moses and Miriam, the sister of Moses. So we have 3 siblings, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. And Miriam gets her celebration with the timbrels and the exaltation. We have the sneak attack by the Amalekites, which I talked about in online. That's something which Israel never forgives, kind of for understandable reasons. And then you have the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, and the 10 Commandments. And the idea, finally, and we've been observing behavior like Jacob's that doesn't necessarily seem ethical. We've been observing a certain lack of regulation in Genesis. One of the reasons there is that is it's before the law. It's before the law was given. Once the law is given, there are very specific regulations about what you can do and what you can't do, and it's all there. The story of Moses, kind of the downer for the narrative reader, is the story of Moses after the giving of the law becomes a bit dry because it's so many different laws in the 3 remaining books of the Torah, of the 5 books of Moses. The 3 remaining books are so filled with laws. Numbers has a bit of narrative, but even there are a lot of laws. And you have the sense that whereas Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they knew about God, but they had to kind of feel their way intuitively through things. Now there's a specific set of laws that people can adhere to. And that's the great gift of the Exodus. And then, as we'll find out, the Israelites eventually get to the Promised Land. Moses dies just before on Mount Nebo. He sees the Promised Land but cannot enter it. And he did sin once when he cried out against God at Meribah. But more generally, I think, Moses is not a Messiah. He isn't like Jesus. He's a great man, but all men are mortal, and no man can have everything. And so Moses does not, even Moses is denied something, who God clearly loves, is denied that entry into the Promised Land. The Exodus is the central event in the history of Israel, and everything refers back to it. And the Exodus is mentioned constantly in the rest of the Old Testament. And as we discussed, with African Americans and with many people who've seen themselves as in need of liberation, the Exodus has provided an inspiring story in a sense that history is not just written by the masters. History is not controlled by people on top. That the losers, that the seeming losers, that the perennially oppressed have, through the intervention of God, have an option for radical change. And the Exodus has always supplied this dimension of hope. I think the Exodus, as opposed to the narratives of Genesis, which are often moral, often adventure stories, the Exodus does have a kind of political message. It's a message about, again, oppression, liberation, domination, and God's deliverance of what is now an entire people. And we're not just talking about family life here. We're talking about a national life, as Israel is no longer a family, but a people. I will leave you now, and we will go on to our next major reading will be Judges, and I'll do another video with that. Okie doke.